She's a former criminal defense attorney turned self-development expert and author of Rise Above the Story. Karina Kilcoyne joining us on Canada Now. Karina, it's great to have you on the show.
Hi, Jeff. I'm so happy to be here.
Oh, likewise to have you. And let's look at your path to happiness and what it took to get there. Let's go back to when you were just 12 years old. Your father went to the federal penitentiary, and that left your family poverty-stricken.
It did. It sure did. And also for me, it created these stories for me, right, of abandonment and worthlessness and the shame and embarrassment of being a felon's daughter. It would take me decades to later learn that I wasn't as alone in that as I thought, because actually like 1 in 5 people have had a parent incarcerated, which is an interesting statistic. Wow. I know. But nonetheless, he did go to the federal penitentiary, and unfortunately, my mother suffered from mental health issues, so depression, anxiety, manic episodes, and just didn't manage the money well, and so we were left poverty-stricken. No electricity, no hot water, food was scarce, and it really created this scarcity mindset for me, and it put me in this caretaker role. So I shifted roles and I changed roles with my mother, and I really led the household and, scrounged up money for food, asked strangers for money for food. And it really took a toll on me. And I would say that it split me emotionally into this 12-year-old girl who felt unworthy of love, and this maven, hell-bent on escape, because I just wanted out of there. And I did escape eventually, but it was just a lot of trauma to carry around for a long time.
But you had 3 siblings to care for as well, not to mention your mother.
Oh, yes, indeed. So I had 2 siblings at the time when my father went to the federal penitentiary, and then a few years later, my mother had my half-brother. Okay. And when she died, I was 24, and my youngest brother was 9, and I adopted and raised him.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And then, not to gloss over that, but somehow, because I want to look at your being 24 years old, and even with all of that, you graduate from law school at 24 years old. Now, did what happened to your father inspire you to get into law and a career fighting for the freedom of others? I mean, is that too easy a connection to be made?
No, I think that's definitely a valid connection. Yeah. Because I had this experience and this, day-to-day conversations with my father as this was all going down, as to what his take on the situation was. I'd gone through periods of time where the FBI was surveilling our house. So, I knew what that was like, to have an FBI agent sitting outside our house in a beige sedan, taking notes and, wondering what do they want? What are they writing? What's going on? And then listening to my father. So yes, there's definitely a reason and a connection there. But also I had this deep desire, as I mentioned, just to escape where I was. And, where I grew up was kind of a rough and tumble place. It was a rusted out steel town on the Ohio-Pennsylvania border. And it was this sense there of, people didn't have jobs, steel mills closed, this kind of a thing. And I understood in an early age, and the poverty I went through, that if I wanted out, I needed a real way out. And luckily for me, that was education.
Wow.
So I put myself through law school because I saw that as a way out. And I did choose law school because it was something that felt right and just and familiar to me.
Were there other ways out? I mean, they would have seemed like ways out at the time, but they certainly weren't. Falling in with the wrong crowd, or, whatever it might be. Were there other avenues that you certainly could have gone down?
Oh, yes, without a doubt. I mean, where I'm from also has a definite reputation of corruption. Multiple politicians getting in trouble, being indicted. And so it just had this stigma to it that was very prevalent. And, you'd hear about it in the news, and you'd hear about it and people would talk about it. So it was this kind of concept of, you could take, one road or you could take the other road. And after watching, what my father lived through and what he chose based on what his story had been, I knew enough to know that I wanted a different life.
The hustle and the grind to get there, on top of what you'd gone through when you were 12 and beyond. And you talked about it, it being the child of a parent that goes to prison and what comes with that. Did all of it eventually catch up to you?
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, so, in those kind of early stages of my life, I shifted into survival mode. And I didn't understand what that meant at the time, right? I was just kind of always in this fight or flight mode of like, oh, we're in survival mode. We need to eat. We need to do this. So, this idea of becoming a self-actualized person where I could think about other things besides the bare necessities took me a long time to get there. Because what I did was I packed all of that shame and all that trauma. There was no space and time to deal with that, because even when I graduated law school, I was now responsible for a 9-year-old. Yeah. And I had to make sure that we survived. And so I, dedicated my time to being the best mother I could be and learning how to be a good lawyer and all of these things. So again, from, my 20s through my 30s, I stuffed all of that. And I found success. But to your question, did it catch up with me? Yes, because no matter the boxes I checked, no matter the success I achieved, I still felt worthless. And, and I started to think, like, why do I feel so empty when I have so much? Like, I thought I thought that if I succeeded, if I ran so far away from who I used to be and where I came from, and I was successful in the world, that somehow magically that would make all my trauma disappear or make all my shame go away. And spoiler alert, it didn't. And when I caught up with that and my depression and my anxiety got full blown, I started to dabble in my 30s in this idea of healing, right? And I go in and out of traditional therapy. But it wasn't until, my early 40s when, something really big happened to me emotionally that I knew I was ready to finally unearth it all.
What happened in your 40s?
I had this beloved dog, a golden retriever named Finn. And he was just everything to me. He was like, my first real experience with unconditional love. And I say that in a way that I felt like this sense of trust and connection with him, where I felt like I wasn't, going to get hurt. And when you're the child of trauma and recurrent trauma, that's a challenge to trust anyone in the world and to become connected to anyone in a real meaningful way, because you don't really even know how to love yourself. So with this dog, he was such a beautiful part of and I didn't even understand when it was happening, but he was such a beautiful part of me opening up. So when he died young, he was 7, he got diagnosed with, incurable cancer. And interestingly enough, he got sick and died around 20 years to the same time as my mom dying of cancer.
Wow.
Yeah. So the parallels and the memories that were coming up of me taking care of her and her dying in my childhood bed and all of these things. And when Finn passed away, it was like the floodgates opened. I was grieving for him, of course, but when it just kept coming out, I realized, oh my gosh, this is more than just about Finn. It's about my mother and my father and my childhood, my lost childhood. Like, I was grieving that finally. And that's when I knew I was ready. I was ready. Like, there was no more putting the cork back on that. Like, It was already out. I was already like in a whole different space mentally and emotionally. And that's when I knew it was time for me to really go on this healing journey.
And leading up to all of that, like, you talk about a life that it's just not sustainable and you're not taking care of yourself. Did you find that your past was defining who you were?
Absolutely. Because the ripple effects, I think that's what a lot of us don't fully wrap our mind around, is the ripple effects of trauma and how they affect you, your relationships, your dreams, who you think you are in the world. And that undoubtedly was me. It was me in relationships, choosing the wrong people, choosing relationships where I was emotionally mistreated because I didn't want a real connection either. So it was easier to feel victimized in a relationship. In my professional life, again, all the things I accomplished and succeeded, I would go out in the world and feel like an imposter. Like, oh, nobody can know any of this old stuff about me, right? So I was constantly on guard that I had to be this particular, good person, right? The good girl in quotes, like I had to do everything right and make sure everybody liked me. And it just was exhausting.
Yeah.
It was exhausting.
Yeah, that's right. Finally, you set out to take care of yourself. But when did you decide to help others break through their own barriers? Like, how did you get to a point where you felt good enough to say, all right, I feel like I'm in a place where I want to be helping others as well?
Well, that's a really deep and great question, because I feel like as a child of trauma, so many of us see it in other people and we immediately want to help. And I think that that's, so wonderful and benevolent, but where we get lost is that typically we are people pleasers, right? And we continue to give of ourselves at the cost of our own happiness and peace. So for me, it was this journey where I really had to get straight with myself and I really had to heal my own wounds. And where it shifted for me, where I felt clear enough and grounded enough that I could offer what I did, was when I started to see the light and I really felt a shift in a love for myself. That was something I was never capable of really loving myself. So when I really figured out how to find compassion for myself and find forgiveness and compassion for the people that I felt hurt me, right? Especially my parents, especially my mother. When I was able to do that, I saw things, I saw the world, I saw my life, I saw who I was in the world completely differently.
Well,
go ahead.
I was just going to ask, you talk about how you were able to help yourself in a loving and nurturing way. How did you get there? Like, how were you able to do that? Because I think there are a lot of people that are out there, maybe yourself included, where they would want to help themselves in a certain way, but they're thinking, well, firstly, who am I to try to help myself? Surely there are other people that need more help than I do. Suck it up. You're fine. And on top of that, just not having a high enough opinion of themselves to say that they deserve help in the first place. How did you get to that place?
That's actually a great point. And I feel like that's one thing that I want to make people so aware of in this whole idea of what I'm doing and how I'm talking and what I'm teaching and what I believe in this book, is a couple of things. You're not alone in your suffering, right? I mean, 70% of us are going to experience trauma in our lifetime. Actually, I bet you that number is even higher, but that's the National Council for Wellbeing. So we'll go with it. But also it's like this idea that we have to take it on the chin. Like we get caught up in this like idea that like, oh yeah, I guess I have to go through my life feeling like meh, like middle of the road or less, because hey, I've gone through a lot of bad stuff and I guess that's just what it's meant for me. That's not true. That's not what we're here for. It took me a long time to get there, but what I know to be true after decades of pain and suffering and healing is that your past doesn't define you at all. You do. And you have the ability, we all do. And that's what I'm so standing firm in the ground on this one, is we all have the power to shift ourselves out of this hurting phase of our life and into happiness. We all deserve happiness. And so many of us have been resonating at this meh level for so long, we don't even know what that feels like. And so for me, how did I get there? It was a lot. And in the book, I was so overwhelmed, right? Like when you go through that kind of trauma, it's overwhelming. You don't know where to start. And so like any good, child of trauma, I took all of my perfectionism and all of my overachieverism, and I dove headfirst into it. I read everything I could about trauma and brain science. I tried all kinds of different therapy, traditional therapy, of course. I believe in that firmly. But all kinds of different modalities, holotropic breath work. I mean, all kinds of things, which I also include in the book, because I feel like healing is kind of like you need a dim sum menu. Like some things work for you, some things don't.
Yeah.
So I am so open about all of that and sharing what I've tried and what I like and what worked. And And I want people to know that. So for me, though, the biggest initial two steps, I would say, for me to get there were wanting to finally heal. Like, you have to want it.
Yeah.
You can't be like, well, I mean, I'm okay with it and I'm not really sure. And if you're not really willing to do the work, because it's work.
Yeah.
And I wanted it. I craved it finally. I was like, the pain of holding it all in was worse than the pain of just letting it out. And I would say the second big thing for me and for anybody would be self-awareness, right? The first step in the formula that I read about is this acknowledging your trauma and acknowledging your story, because they're two different things. They're completely two different things. And that was when I learned about that, and like what your brain does in the presence of trauma and how it creates a story. I had to understand that there was factually what happened to me. My father went to prison. And then there was the story, the subjective component that I wrote about who I was because my father went to prison. Right. So those were the two big things that really shifted me into a space of healing.
You also talk about identifying what we love most about ourselves and getting the most out of it. And I think that's an important thing to highlight, because I think it's only human nature that with just about everything in our lives, we might too much dwell on the negative. And it may be in an introspective look, we will dwell on our negatives and where we believe we fall short. But you make a point of saying that we need to highlight what we should be celebrating about ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I do. And I tell you what, that took me a long time to get there. And in fact, a lot of this too, this healing is, never a one and done, right?
Yeah.
Like, we all have these stories for so long, and my default settings are what they are, and it takes real self-awareness and work to get out of them. So these things about like celebrating your wins, that is so important, because for people who are, box checkers and like, oh, I'm going to go out in the world and do all these things, right? And then, even for people who are having a hard time, right, these days, like, I love to say this, like, for me, there are moments in my life when I was in therapy and healing that, getting out of bed, taking a shower and calling my therapist was a win. Right? Like, celebrate your win. Like, if that's a win for you, it's a win for you, and celebrate it. Like, there's no comparison of healing. There's no comparison of trauma. There's no like, there's going to be a big medal ceremony at the end. It's about honoring yourself and getting yourself to where you feel so good and so present and so alive. And that whole idea of learning to love yourself is a huge part of what I believe in and what I want people to know and to tap into, because if you are filled with shame, or you're carrying around stuff from your past and you're tethered to that version of you, it's impossible to love yourself. And if you want to get to happiness and healing, loving yourself and getting there is key. And, I used to get so like angry, like people would say like, oh, just love yourself, everything will be fine. And it's, you can't just do it. It's not like flipping a switch, right? There are, especially when you spend so many years not, and you weren't taught, because you weren't parented with learning to develop self-esteem and confidence in who you are in the world. So as an adult, like, then you're learning all of that from scratch and you're teaching it to yourself. So there are so many different things you can do, but I love that one. Celebrating your wins is important.
It really is. And, Karina, I'm in my mid to late 40s now, and I look back and, you talk about self-esteem and confidence. Like, I feel like it wasn't until my 40s where I felt whatever good I was getting, I deserved. Like, I owned my own place in life, like my lot in life. Like, I've earned it and I deserve it as much as anybody else. Like, for a long time, professionally, personally, whatever, you feel, well, I should just be grateful for whatever I'm getting. Like, wow, I can't believe I got that. Like, I should just be grateful. And then you get to a point where you feel what you've gotten has been more than earned. And you also feel this freedom of, I don't know if I speak for everybody, but I know I did, where I go, I really don't care what other people think. It really doesn't matter. And then you get a bit of a different perspective on life and what really matters. And for me, it was becoming a parent. It really helped me in figuring out, well, what really matters at the end of the day. When I look back at the end of the day, what really made me happy? And more often than not, it's the little moments I have with my kids that, might very often go overlooked. How much did age for you play a part in arriving to where you are right now?
I love what you just shared. I feel like I had that experience as well. And it took me, it took me time to get there, because I think for a while I was focused on, well, like I said, I was surviving. So I can't say I was focused on the wrong things, right? It was like earning money and doing these things, sure. But when I really started to understand who I wanted to be and how I wanted to be different, I felt like that's when things shifted for me. And I love this experience now. I feel like I have the same thing where I don't care what people think.
Yeah.
I don't. I feel like, and because the truth is, honestly, you only think that they're thinking about you half the time, right? Like people are so caught up in their own world. Like you just think they're thinking about you, right? But like it was funny. I have this newsletter that I send out twice a month, and I talk about my dog or whatever in it every once in a while, because I'm a huge animal. I'm a huge believer in what animals do for us. And this lady wrote me back, and she said, "I just want you to know I've unsubscribed from your newsletter because I don't care about dogs. I don't want to hear about you talking to your dog. I don't want to care what your dog thinks." And I was like, okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye. Like, you're not my people, right?
Fine.
Like,
yeah.
So I feel like it was healing, and it was absolutely age. I got to a point where I thought, my mother died when she was 44 years old.
Wow.
And, when I was younger, I thought, well, I guess I kind of understood like that's young. But, when I'm 24, you think 44 is kind of whatever. And then as I approached that age, I thought, oh my God, she was so young.
Yes.
Right. And I had this whole different level of compassion for her about what that must have been like to be dying at that age. Like, that's just, I can't even wrap my head around that, because age is such an important factor, I feel like, when it comes to that emotional freedom.
Yeah.
Right. That we finally get to that point in our life.
It's a nice place to be. And I'm glad you're there, given what you've been through. And check out KarinaKilcoyne.com. I'm going to do that as well and sign up for the newsletter, because I would like to hear more about Finn. And her book, Rise Above the Story. Karina Kilcoyne, congratulations on your book and all your success. And we really appreciate you joining us and telling your story. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. I really enjoyed our conversation.